When word reached Harlem that Dutch Schultz wanted Bumpy Johnson dead, the streets did not erupt in panic. They went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from fear, but the kind that comes when everybody knows something irreversible has been set in motion. Conversations lowered. Eyes lingered longer at street corners. Dice games paused mid-roll, because Dutch Schultz did not make idle threats, and Bumpy Johnson did not bow to any man living. It was late summer, the kind of Harlem night where heat clung to brick walls and sweat-stained collars even after sunset. Inside a back room off 133rd Street, the air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Bumpy Johnson sat at the head of the table, hat tilted just enough to shadow his eyes, hands folded calmly as men twice his size argued in low, urgent voices. "Dutch ain't bluffing," one of them said. "He already put a price on you. Real money." Bumpy didn't move, didn't blink. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. "Then he's late." The room stilled, because this wasn't just about a hit. This wasn't just about territory or money. This was about who controlled Harlem, and whether an Italian mob boss from the Bronx thought he could decide the fate of a black king in his own kingdom. Dutch Schultz had made his name on blood and beer, ruthless, paranoid, violent even by mob standards. He ruled numbers rackets and breweries with a clenched fist, killing partners and enemies alike when they became inconvenient. To Dutch, Harlem was a market, a resource, something to be owned. But to Bumpy Johnson, Harlem was home. And men did not come into his home and issue death warrants without consequence. Long before Dutch Schultz's name carried fear up and down the East Coast, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had already earned a reputation that traveled faster than his footsteps. Born in South Carolina, raised by Harlem's unforgiving streets, Bumpy was equal parts intellect and intimidation. He read Shakespeare and philosophy in prison cells, quoted poetry in pool halls, and enforced his will with quiet precision. He was not loud. He did not posture. He did not need to. By the early 1930s, Harlem was a battleground disguised as a neighborhood. Prohibition had turned liquor into gold, numbers into empires, and violence into a language everyone spoke fluently. Italian mobsters, Irish gangs, corrupt politicians, and crooked cops all circled the same prize. Harlem sat at the center, rich with money, culture, and desperation. White syndicates believed they owned it. They were wrong. Bumpy Johnson rose through Harlem's underworld not by reckless brutality, but by calculated dominance. He understood people. He understood leverage. And most importantly, he understood respect. Where others ruled through fear alone, Bumpy ruled through balance. Fear for those who crossed him, protection for those who stood with him. Store owners paid because they knew he would keep them safe. Numbers runners stayed loyal because he paid fair and punished betrayal cleanly. The community whispered his name not as a criminal, but as a necessary force, a shield against worse predators, and that is what made Dutch Schultz nervous. Dutch did not fear many men, but Bumpy Johnson represented something dangerous: independence. A black man controlling black territory without answering to Italian bosses. A man who refused to be a junior partner in his own neighborhood. At first, Schultz tried diplomacy. Envoys were sent, meetings proposed, profit splits discussed. Bumpy listened, then declined. That refusal echoed louder than gunfire. To Dutch Schultz, being told no was not just an insult. It was a challenge to his authority, and challenges had to be crushed publicly, violently, and completely. So he made a decision. Bumpy Johnson had to die. The order didn't come with fanfare, just quiet instructions passed through trusted hands. A shooter from out of town. No local connections, no loose ends. Clean and final. But Dutch underestimated one thing. Harlem talked, and loyalty, when earned properly, traveled faster than money. By the time the hit was finalized, Bumpy already knew the details. Where, when, and roughly how. He knew the shooter's habits, knew who had been approached, knew which corners had suddenly grown unfamiliar faces. And still, he didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked Harlem openly, suit pressed, shoes polished, presence deliberate. Each step was a message: I am not afraid. Those closest to him urged caution. Lay low, they said. Let this blow over. Bumpy's response was measured, almost gentle. If I disappear, he said, then Dutch owns Harlem. And that won't happen while I'm breathing. Because Bumpy understood something that Dutch never would. Power wasn't just about killing a man. It was about what happened after. By the time Dutch Schultz realized his plan had been compromised, it was already too late to turn back. Pride wouldn't allow it. Reputation demanded follow-through. To hesitate now would invite weakness, and weakness in that world was fatal. So the collision was inevitable. Two empires, two philosophies, one neighborhood, and Harlem was about to witness a confrontation that would not just decide who lived and who died, but redefine how power itself operated in the streets of New York. The city held its breath. Because when Dutch Schultz wanted Bumpy Johnson dead, he didn't just pick a fight with a man, he picked a fight with a legend in the making. The days that followed were heavy with anticipation. Harlem moved, but cautiously, like a fighter circling the ring, measuring distance, waiting for the first strike. Every car that slowed too long drew eyes. Every unfamiliar face was catalogued and remembered. This was not panic. This was preparation. Dutch Schultz believed fear traveled downward. He believed once word spread that he had marked Bumpy Johnson for death, Harlem would soften, that Bumpy's people would fracture, that survival instincts would override loyalty. Instead, the opposite happened. Numbers runners tightened routes. Lookouts doubled shifts. Men who had never carried weapons before suddenly did. And through it all, Bumpy Johnson remained visible, calmly present, almost defiant in his routine. He ate at the same restaurants, walked the same blocks, sat in the same back rooms, listening more than he spoke. That visibility was intentional because hiding suggested vulnerability, and vulnerability invited takeover. Dutch Schultz interpreted Bumpy's calm as arrogance. That Harlem nigger thinks he's untouchable, Schultz snapped during a meeting in the Bronx, pacing like a caged animal. His lieutenants watched carefully. Schultz's moods were unpredictable, and his violence often arrived without warning. He ain't, one man offered carefully, just protected. Schultz stopped, pacing. No one's protected, he said flatly. They're just waiting to learn it. But Dutch had a problem he couldn't punch his way through. Harlem wasn't the Bronx. It wasn't Manhattan. Italian muscle didn't move freely there without consequence, and every outsider stood out no matter how careful. So Schultz did what he always did when brute force stalled. He applied pressure from the shadows. Police raids increased overnight. Number spots were hit with suspicious precision. Licenses vanished. Store owners suddenly found themselves fined or shut down. Men loyal to Bumpy were arrested on thin charges, held just long enough to disrupt operations, then released without apology. It was warfare dressed as law enforcement, and Bumpy knew exactly where it came from. He stood at the window of a Lenox Avenue apartment one evening, watching patrol cars idle below, lights dark, but engines running. He didn't curse, didn't pace. He simply observed. "Dutch is squeezing the city," one of his men said behind him, "trying to starve us out." Bumpy nodded slowly. "He's impatient," he replied. "That's good." Because impatience led to mistakes. The real challenge came 3 nights later. A message arrived, not whispered through intermediaries, not carried by nervous associates, but delivered directly. A meeting request. Neutral ground, downtown Manhattan. 1 table, no weapons visible. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Dutch Schultz. Most men would have refused. It reeked of a trap. Even suggesting such a meeting was an insult, an implication that Bumpy Johnson could be summoned like a subordinate. But Bumpy didn't refuse. He read the note once, then folded it neatly. "Set it up," he said. The room erupted. "You can't meet him," one man protested. "That's suicide." Bumpy turned, eyes steady. "No," he said. "That's clarity." Because Bumpy understood something Dutch did not. Confrontation, when controlled, was power. A face-to-face meeting forced rules into existence. It created witnesses. It created memory, and memory outlived bullets. The restaurant was small, upscale, and deliberately quiet, a place where deals were made softly and violence waited outside. Dutch Schultz arrived first, flanked by men who scanned exits and corners like predators. He chose his seat with a clear view of the door. When Bumpy Johnson walked in, conversation across the room dipped without anyone meaning to stop. He didn't bring a crowd, just 2 men positioned subtly behind him, eyes alert but calm. Dutch stood. For a moment, they studied each other. 2 men from different worlds, bound by the same brutal economy. "Mr. Johnson," Schultz said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You look well." Bumpy removed his hat slowly, placed it beside him, and sat without responding to the greeting. "I hear you've been busy," Bumpy said evenly. Schultz chuckled. "Business is business?" "No," Bumpy replied. "This is personal." The table fell silent. Schultz leaned forward. "You're sitting on something valuable," he said. "Harlem's profitable. Always has been, but it could be more profitable with the right structure." Bumpy met his gaze. "You already tried structure," he said. "It didn't fit?" Schultz's smile thinned. "I don't like being told no." "I imagine not." That was the moment the temperature changed. Schultz's voice hardened. "Let me be clear. You work with me or you work against me, and men who work against me tend to stop working altogether." Bumpy didn't flinch. "You put a hit on me," he said calmly. "That wasn't business. That was disrespect." Schultz shrugged. "You're alive." "For now." The words weren't a threat. They were a reminder. The meeting ended without agreement, but not without understanding. Schultz left knowing one thing with certainty. Bumpy Johnson would not bend, and men who wouldn't bend had to be broken. But Bumpy left with something far more valuable. Confirmation. Dutch Schultz was running out of options, and desperate men made loud mistakes. As Bumpy stepped back into the night, Harlem's distant glow reflected in his eyes. He already knew how this would end. Not with a reckless shootout, not with chaos, but with a lesson, delivered carefully, publicly, and permanently. Because when power challenged power, only one could remain standing, and the streets of Harlem were already choosing their side. After the meeting, Dutch Schultz didn't sleep. He drank instead, hard and fast, his mind replaying the calm in Bumpy Johnson's eyes. That calm unsettled him more than threats ever could. Most men in Bumpy's position begged, bluffed, or tried to disappear. Bumpy had done none of that. To Schultz, that meant one thing: defiance. And defiance had to be punished before it inspired imitation. Within days, Dutch escalated. Not subtly this time, not carefully. A trusted lieutenant in Harlem was ambushed on his way home, beaten badly, left alive but broken. The message was crude, unmistakable. Windows of numbers' houses were smashed. A runner vanished for 2 days and returned shaken, refusing to speak about where he'd been or who had taken him. It was no longer business pressure, it was terror. Harlem felt it immediately. Mothers pulled children inside earlier, store owners locked doors at dusk. Men whispered on corners, glancing over shoulders mid-sentence. And through it all, one question echoed quietly but persistently. What is Bumpy going to do? Because silence from a man like Bumpy Johnson didn't mean uncertainty. It meant calculation. Bumpy convened his inner circle in a closed bar after hours. The lights were low, the bottles untouched, faces serious. No one joked, no one raised their voice. He listened as each man reported damage, losses, fear spreading through the community. When they finished, Bumpy sat back, fingers steepled. "Dutch wants a reaction," he said. "Noise, blood, something he can point to and justify what comes next." One man leaned forward. "So what do we do?" Bumpy's gaze moved slowly around the room. "We don't give him that." A pause. "We give him something worse." They waited. "We expose him." Eyes narrowed. Confusion flickered. "Dutch Schultz isn't powerful because he's strong," Bumpy continued. "He's powerful because people are afraid of him, because politicians look away, because police pretend they don't see." He leaned forward now. "So we make sure they see." What followed was not violence, but precision. Bumpy began feeding information, quietly, selectively, to the right ears. Not rumors, facts, dates, names, payoffs, shipments, police captains on Schultz's payroll, judges who owed him favors, numbers tied to brewery fronts and slush funds. It wasn't revenge, it was strategy. Because Bumpy understood systems. He knew that mobs didn't fall when shot at, they fell when exposed. At the same time, he made another move. He reached out to men who despised Dutch Schultz even more than they feared him. The Italian syndicate. Schultz had never been trusted by his own kind. He was volatile, unpredictable, a liability who drew too much attention. And now, thanks to his war in Harlem, that attention was burning brighter by the day. Word traveled. Dutch was making noise again. Dutch was pushing too hard. Dutch was endangering everyone. Bumpy didn't need to threaten anyone. He simply let facts drift into the right conversations. Let concern take root. Let fear change sides. Dutch felt it before he understood it. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Allies suddenly became distant. His usual protection, political and criminal alike, began to thin. Paranoia gnawed at him. He started seeing betrayal in every silence. "Someone's talking," he snapped at her, "Lieutenant. Find out who." But the truth was worse than betrayal. Everyone was watching, and that meant Dutch Schultz, The man who ruled through intimidation was suddenly isolated. The breaking point came one rainy evening when Schultz learned federal investigators were reopening old cases that had been buried for years. Evidence resurfaced, witnesses reconsidered, pressure mounted. Schultz raged. "This is Johnson," he barked. "That Harlem bastard set this in motion." He wasn't wrong, but by then it didn't matter, because the machine had started moving. Bumpy Johnson did not celebrate. He walked Harlem the same as always, nodding to elders, pausing to speak with shop owners, listening to the pulse of the streets. They watched him with renewed faith, because he hadn't brought chaos. He'd brought control. And in that control, they felt protected. Then came the final confrontation, not between Bumpy and Schultz, but between Dutch Schultz and his own world, summoned to a meeting he couldn't refuse. Surrounded by men who had once benefited from his brutality and now saw him as a threat. The decision was quiet, efficient, final. Dutch Schultz was marked, not by Harlem, but by his own. When news of Schultz's shooting spread, Harlem did not cheer. It exhaled, because this wasn't about triumph. It was about survival. Bumpy Johnson stood at his window once more, watching the city absorb the shift in power. He knew what had happened, and he knew why. Dutch Schultz had wanted him dead. Instead, Dutch Schultz had been erased, and Harlem remained. The streets would remember this moment, not as a war, but as a lesson. You could threaten Harlem. You could exploit it. But if you tried to own it, you answered to Bumpy Johnson. Dutch Schultz did not die quietly. When the bullets found him in that Newark dining room, they didn't just tear through flesh. They shattered an illusion. The illusion that brute force alone could rule an empire. The Rakika illusion that fear, unchecked, could last forever. News traveled fast, but understanding traveled slower. In Harlem, the first reports came in fragments. A shooting, a mob boss down, names whispered but not confirmed. Men leaned over radios, women paused mid-conversation. Even the streets seemed to listen. Then the name landed. Dutch Schultz. Dead. For a long moment, Harlem stood still, not because they mourned him, but because they understood the significance. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a verdict, and everyone knew who had written the closing argument. Bumpy Johnson heard the news in a back room filled with men who had braced themselves for war, and instead witnessed a masterstroke. No cheers erupted, no glasses clinked, just a quiet acknowledgement of reality settling into place. One man finally spoke. "It's over." Bumpy shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "it's decided." Because power didn't vanish when a man died. It transferred. It restructured. It recalibrated. And the aftermath was where legends were truly tested. Within days, the vacuum left by Schultz began pulling at the city. Smaller operators rushed to fill gaps. Opportunists tested boundaries. Old enemies sniffed around Harlem's edges, wondering if Bumpy Johnson would stumble now that the storm had passed. He didn't. Instead, he moved deliberately, meeting with community leaders, consolidating alliances, enforcing order with restraint rather than terror. Where Schultz had ruled through chaos, Bumpy ruled through presence. That contrast was impossible to ignore. Italian syndicate representatives approached quietly, carefully. There was no apology. Men like that didn't apologize. But there was acknowledgement. Harlem was his. Business would continue, on his terms. But the real confrontation, the one that cemented the legend, did not happen with guns or fists. It happened in rooms with badges. The police pressure didn't vanish overnight. If anything, it intensified briefly. Raids continued. Stops increased. A final attempt to assert dominance before the new balance settled. Bumpy allowed it for a time. Then he responded. He walked into a precinct house one afternoon unannounced. Not hiding, not escorted. Just Bumpy Johnson, hat in hand, eyes steady. The desk sergeant looked up, startled. "I need to speak to your captain," Bumpy said calmly. The room stiffened. Moments later, the captain emerged, an old fixture, known for his connections, known for his flexibility. "What can I do for you, Johnson?" the captain asked, tone guarded. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. "You've been enforcing the wrong orders," he said. The captain scoffed. "You don't give orders here?" Bumpy nodded. "No, but I know who does, and I know what happens when certain names are spoken out loud." Silence stretched. Bumpy leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Dutch Schultz is dead. The attention he brought is still warm. Federal eyes are everywhere. And if this precinct keeps pushing Harlem the way it has been, names will surface that don't want daylight." The captain swallowed. This wasn't a threat. It was a map. Within weeks, the raids slowed. Harassment eased. The balance restored itself, not through fear, but through mutual understanding of consequences. Word spread quietly through law enforcement. Harlem had a new equilibrium, and Bumpy Johnson was at the center of it. People often misunderstand moments like this. They imagine power declared loudly, violently. But true power announces itself through results. No more random beatings, no more reckless encroachments. Business resumed with structure. The streets felt safer, not because crime disappeared, but because chaos had been restrained. Elders noticed, shop owners noticed, mothers noticed, and they remembered. Years later, men would argue over details, over who said what, over how much influence Bumpy truly had. But no one argued the outcome. Dutch Schultz had wanted Bumpy Johnson dead. Instead, Dutch Schultz was gone, and Harlem stood intact. Not conquered, not sold, protected. Bumpy never spoke publicly about Schultz, never claimed credit, never needed to. Legends didn't require confessions. They left evidence. As autumn settled over Harlem, Bumpy walked the neighborhood one evening, coat collar turned up against the chill. People nodded as he passed, not out of fear, but recognition. He returned each nod quietly, because this was never about dominance for its own sake. It was about dignity. And when dignity was threatened, Bumpy Johnson answered, not with chaos, but with consequence. The war that never fully ignited had still changed everything. And Harlem would never forget the moment it learned the difference between power that takes and power that stands. The true measure of what happened didn't appear in headlines. It appeared in absence. No more unfamiliar cars idling too long on Harlem corners. No more out-of-town enforcers testing the neighborhood like it was unclaimed land. The tension that had once crept into every conversation began to loosen its grip. Harlem exhaled, and in that exhale, people understood something important had shifted, not temporarily, but fundamentally. Dutch Schultz's death sent shockwaves far beyond Harlem, but its most profound impact was local. The Italian syndicate recalibrated quickly. They had lost a volatile asset and gained a cautionary lesson. Harlem was no longer a place to be taken. It was a place to be negotiated with, on equal footing. That distinction mattered. Bumpy Johnson did not throw parades. He did not mark the occasion. Instead, he focused on stability. Meetings were held with numbers operators, club owners, and community figures. Rules were clarified, boundaries drawn, consequences outlined, not cruelly, but unmistakably. There would be no vacuum, and there would be no chaos. Justice, in Bumpy's world, did not mean bloodshed for its own sake. It meant restoring balance. The men who had been beaten during Schultz's escalation were quietly compensated. Families who had suffered losses found envelopes where they were needed most. No speeches, no acknowledgements, just resolution. That mattered to Harlem more than any act of revenge ever could. Because this wasn't about ego. It was about protection. The police, sensing the shift, adjusted their posture. Aggressive tactics gave way to selective enforcement. The unspoken agreement, fragile but real, was respected on both sides. It wasn't peace, but it was order. And order was priceless. Bumpy's influence grew not because he demanded it, but because it proved effective. When disputes arose, his word settled them. When outsiders asked who controlled Harlem, the answer was no longer whispered. It was stated plainly. Bumpy Johnson, not as a tyrant, as a constant. Even his enemies respected the outcome. Men who had doubted his restraint now understood its strength. He had outmaneuvered a man known for violence without becoming what he opposed. That distinction elevated him, because fear could command obedience, but respect commanded loyalty. Years later, historians would debate the morality of men like Bumpy Johnson. They would tally crimes, question methods, and dissect motivations. But the people who lived there remembered something simpler. When Harlem was threatened, he stood. When outsiders tried to claim ownership, he refused. And when violence loomed, he chose a path that spared the neighborhood from becoming a battlefield. That was justice in Harlem's eyes, not perfect, but earned. The aftermath of Dutch Schultz's death marked a turning point. Organized crime in New York grew more structured, more cautious. Harlem retained its autonomy longer than anyone expected. The balance between street power and institutional authority evolved, not eliminated, but moderated. And at the center of that evolution stood one man who understood leverage better than bullets. Bumpy Johnson continued his life as he always had, measured, thoughtful, dangerous when necessary, dignified when possible. He never spoke of Dutch Schultz again. He didn't need to. The absence spoke louder, Harlem remembered. And memory, when shared by an entire community, became legend. Time did what it always does. It blurred details, softened edges, turned moments into stories. But it never erased the truth. Years after Dutch Schultz's name faded into footnotes and cautionary tales, Bumpy Johnson's remained alive in Harlem, spoken with a mix of respect, gratitude, and quiet awe. Not because he had been the most violent man in the room, but because he had been the most deliberate. That distinction mattered. Younger men coming up in the streets heard the story not as gossip, but as instruction. They learned that Harlem was not inherited by brute force. It was defended through loyalty, intelligence, and restraint. They learned that when power overreached, it exposed itself. And when patience was paired with precision, even the most feared men could fall. Without a single shot fired in Harlem, that was the part people never forgot. Bumpy's reputation extended beyond the neighborhood. Politicians learned to listen carefully when his name entered a conversation. Syndicate leaders treated Harlem as a partnership rather than a prize. Law enforcement, publicly dismissive, privately aware, understood the limits of pressure. This was not written law, it was lived reality, and it endured. What set Bumpy Johnson apart was not that he survived Dutch Schultz, it was how he survived him. He didn't become reckless afterward, didn't chase expansion for ego's sake. He remained rooted in Harlem, tied to its rhythms, accountable to its people. That consistency turned influence into legacy, because power that lasts is power that serves a purpose. Harlem elders would later say the neighborhood felt different after that season. Still dangerous, still complicated, but no longer disposable, no longer treated like a colony to be exploited. It had boundaries, and those boundaries were respected. Bumpy Johnson's name came to represent something larger than himself. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a protector. To most, he was both, and that duality defined the era. But no one denied this. When Harlem faced its greatest external threat, Bumpy Johnson stood between the neighborhood and destruction. And Harlem survived. The story of Dutch Schultz became a warning whispered in underworld circles. Not about Harlem's toughness, but about its intelligence. About what happened when arrogance met strategy, when unchecked brutality collided with a man who understood systems better than violence. Dutch Schultz wanted to make an example. Instead, he became one. As the years passed, Bumpy aged, endured prison, returned, and remained what he had always been, a figure larger than any single moment. But that confrontation, that quiet war that never exploded, remained central to his legend. It proved that true dominance did not always announce itself with blood. Sometimes it arrived with patience. And in Harlem, patience changed everything. This story was never just about Dutch Schultz. It was about what happens when raw power mistakes fear for permanence. When a man believes violence alone entitles him to ownership. When an empire built on intimidation forgets that every neighborhood has a breaking point. Dutch Schultz wanted Bumpy Johnson dead because Bumpy represented something he couldn't control. Autonomy, dignity, limits. What followed wasn't a war filled with headlines and body counts. It was something far more dangerous to men like Schultz: exposure, isolation, and consequence. Bumpy Johnson didn't meet brutality with chaos. He met it with intelligence, with patience, with an understanding that real power doesn't rush, it waits. And when it moves, it doesn't miss. Harlem didn't remember this moment because a mob boss fell. Harlem remembered it because the neighborhood stood, because for once, an outside force tried to impose its will and failed, not through noise, but through resolve. This wasn't about one man's pride. It was about a community refusing to be treated as property, about drawing a line and holding it without apology, about showing the world that respect once earned could be enforced without becoming the very thing you opposed. Bumpy Johnson became a legend not because he was untouchable, but because he was accountable. Accountable to his people, to his streets, to the idea that power meant responsibility. Dutch Schultz wanted Bumpy Johnson erased. Instead, history erased Dutch Schultz, and Harlem learned a lesson that still echoes through time. Fear can take territory, but only respect can hold it.